are listening to KGNU, Boulder, Denver, and Fort Collins. I am Rosana Longo, host of the Trends podcast, and we will continue the conversation this morning with a panel of guests in studios. We have Ramon Gabrielov Parrish, his core candidate assistant professor, who we heard in the podcast teaching the diversity seminar at Naropa. We also have Shikita Yarbrough, Community Engagement Equity Manager at YWCA of Boulder County. And we also have Shahini Raudbari, Assistant Professor of Social Justice and Architecture in CU as part of the Environmental Design. Welcome, you guys. I'm so happy that you're here today with me. And I want to first let Shikita talk to us and, talk to us about this topic of diversity that is even, is that even the right word to use? We heard different opinions on that in the podcast. What is it? Do we need to use other terms like inclusion and equity instead of diversity? I heard that diversity is now a compromise. It's a word that really is complex now because it really talks about a diverse worldview and not what at least I used to think about, implying that it's talking about minorities and people of color or trying to include them in decision making. So I would like, Shikita, for you to take it.
Yes, thank you for having me here today. Yes, diversity, you are correct. I think our society are trying to come up with terms in order for them to check the box on, making things happen, saying, oh yeah, we are actually working on that. Inclusion, equity. But at the same time, how are we defining diversity? Each organization, how are they defining? Each community, how are we defining diversity? So I think we are putting diversity in a box, and it is really broad. And in each community is really broad. So in different countries, diversity is totally different compared to Boulder, Colorado. Chicago diversity is totally different, so I believe it's different being raised in Chicago. So we didn't have the problem of diversity of culture or people, but here it's an issue. I believe it's an issue. So I think it is just pertinent to whatever community that you live in and the issues. So diversity could be age group, right? So like I'm on the board with the League of Women Voters. So it's not a diverse board because most of our board members are over the age of 60. So it's not diverse. So how do we define diversity? So, I think that depends on that organization, that community, I think we need to know what that means for us.
Yes, and, diversity is one thing, but equity and inclusion is another one. So that's the reason why I'm thinking at this point we really need to bring those words to talk about this topic. But what is a white space? What's a white space? That's what I have been thinking about white space. How do we define a white space? So I would really like if you, Ramon Gabrielov Parrish, can talk to us about a white space. I was lucky enough to sit at a class, and your class is a diversity seminar at Naropa, and it was an amazing experience for me. And seeing your students define the words that you ask them to define by also using their own experience, life experience, was an eye-opener for me. So I would really like for you to talk to us. What is this white space thing?
Sure. First of all, I just want to shout out the Naropa Diversity Seminar. Just big up, y'all. So white space, I think something that happens with a lot of, I think oftentimes white people are unaware that they have a culture or cultures in the United States. And I think oftentimes white people tend to think of themselves as individuals and as not part of a group, and tend to think of themselves as not acting in a way that is like that a group acts, right? And so, another way to talk about groups and the behavior of groups is to talk about culture. So I think a lot of times white people are unconscious of their culture, and that people who are not white, who come into white spaces or white cultural spaces, are very aware of moving into a different like cultural membrane, and also a cultural membrane that historically has had more power and has been historically hostile or violent to non-white people. And so when non-white people move into a white space, there's even oftentimes a different like bodily posture that you take on, right? And I think this is something that I think a lot of white people aren't aware of. There's like, culture goes down into our posture. It goes down into our embodiment. And so there's the bodily posture, there's different ways of speaking, and there's different expectations about time. There's different expectations about how much or how little emotion that you show. Like there's all kinds of kind of cultural expectations that exist in this white space. And so I think one of the first things that white people can do is actually cultivate an awareness and acknowledge the fact that they're not just individuals. And I understand that that's like an ideal in white and Western European society, is that you break from culture and become an individual. But even as you do that, like in the United States, you're still speaking English, right? Are you wearing blue jeans, right? Like, are you wearing a North Face jacket? And like anyone who comes from outside of that culture will see these things right away. So I think, just developing understanding for a lot of white people that you are part of a group, and that your group has certain norms and not all other people share those norms, and that there is a asymmetry or historical and current asymmetry of power and a violence that has come with that power. So when other non-white people enter into white spaces, there's like almost a touch of danger to it in a lot of cases, especially now in like what's happening in the country.
Especially now, yes. Just this morning we heard from sad news in Germany, where 9 people were killed by white supremacy person that it happens. Things like that happen, and that's what it is. It's like what you're saying, what's happening right now. Going to your class, Ramon, was an experience, and listening to all your students talking about it and sharing their stories was really, really a wonderful experience for me. You're such a scholar, but we also have another scholar here. We have Shaheen. He has come from CU to talk about about this. It's really interesting because I also had the opportunity to go and visit the installation called Racism in Architecture, and that was amazing. So we heard from one of the students involved in your Racism in Architecture exhibit, and we heard her and others express how actual spaces, buildings can be racist. How is that?
Actually, building on what Ramon was saying, these white spaces, and I think something you talked about, sort of how we embody that experience. It happens in architecture as well. And I think there's this one idea that's been helpful for me, and I'm still struggling with understanding the definition of it, but this idea of hegemonic white space. And the way I understand that is that certain spaces guide us to operate in ways that we then think is normal. So the whiteness of space, we normalize and we reproduce it through how we behave in that space. So take a public space like the Pearl Street Mall. There are ways that we operate in that space, whether we're white or not, that we kind of take some of the postures, the movement, the circulation that other people, that we all use to inhabit a space, but it becomes racialized and it becomes white. And so this idea of the hegemonic nature of space, to me, emphasizes how, I guess, entrenched the experience of space can be for people of various races. And so Joyce Bell is a sociologist who helps think about this in The Courtroom. And that's a really great illustration to, I think, share. She talks about how circulation is limited, how hierarchy, where the judge sits, where the jury sits, where the defendant sits, where the audience sits. These are all aspects of the architecture that shape the experience of a racialized and a racist system of justice. So that's an example from The Courtroom. You can think about it in a classroom as well, where there are certain ways we teach and we produce and consume knowledge that we take for granted as being the norm, where there's a quote unquote expert sitting at a lectern, standing at a lectern, and then quote unquote students in the audience sitting in the seats, in the stadium seating, who are learning material from that expert. And there's symbolism in the space, pictures of white professors. All these come together to shape the experience in that space of what it means to share knowledge. And architecture houses that and sort of formalizes and crystallizes the nature of that exchange, again, through where bodies are positioned in space. But ultimately, this experience of the space is couched in sort of a history of racial difference. And so just as our educational institutions reflect that, sort of the spaces of those educational institutions. So there's a couple examples.
Yeah, as we were working on this podcast, I said to Maeve, really, this is something that we need to touch. Really touch this deep thing about spaces, how we occupy spaces, how we feel when we walk into a place, or we are experiencing the surroundings. And the exhibit that you had at CU was really amazing because it had, the exhibit in itself, but also the poems, the softness, so that we can really be confronting this difficult issue. But in a way that was, thoughtful and profound, really profound.
I would like to mention the safe spaces as far as when he was talking about, it becomes normal, right? We normalize it. And that just brought up in a time when I had a friend to visit from Texas, and she had never been on Pearl Street. She hadn't been to Boulder. And she's originally from the island of Tonga. And so we were walking on Pearl Street, and she said, "Shakita, Boulder is so bright." And I'm walking, I'm like, no, not really. It's just, maybe the sun will come out pretty soon, but it's not that bright. It just got through raining. What you talking? And I literally didn't know what she was talking about. And we're walking, and she said, no. Boulder is very bright. So much so, I'm uncomfortable. Mm. And I was like, oh, girl. I was like, girl, please. I'm so used to it. I forgot to tell you. I didn't tell you. So it was normal. The stares and people looking at you and react a certain way. So I know how to, change my posture when I walk into a certain place. And so she picked up on that. And I was used to it. And it's unfortunate we have to do that, but it's so true. It's true. Someone coming from another state noticed that. Yes,
Chiquita, I can share with you that I have always said to people that I walk, if I walk in Pearl Street, I also feel like I'm a freckle walking down the street. So, yes, I can share with you that same feeling. You are listening to KGNU. I am Rosana Longo, host of the Trends podcast, and we are continuing the conversation on diversity this morning with a panel of guests in studio. We have Ramon Gabrielov Parrish, core candidate assistant professor at Naropa. We have Shikita Yarbrough, community engagement equity manager at YWCA of Boulder County. And we have Shaheen Raubari, assistant professor of social justice and architecture at CU Environmental Design. And, I really pick, Shahini, the social justice, because I know you teach many other classes at CU. And in those classes, I'm pretty sure you also are always bringing this idea of spaces and buildings. You recently also talk about prisons and courts, how they are designed. And I remember that when I was interviewing you, you also mentioned about the situation that students at CU, if they are of color, they are much more aware of the cameras around. So if you can speak about that.
Oh, yeah. This came up, and I credit the students. There was this class, a really wonderful class for me to learn from, about dissent in design and how do we challenge the status quo. And one of the conversations we had was the students were leading this conversation about how they experience the campus space with different demographic characteristics. And a few things that came out. One was this idea of color lines that persist on campus, and a group of students were talking about this underpass that goes under Broadway from campus to University Hill, and they were describing that as a barrier where the hill is perceived as a more dominantly white space, and so a lot of students of color do not pass under that. And if they're going to go recreate or have food, or they'll go to the UMC or other the University Memorial Center or other spaces on campus where they feel safer. And another student brought up this idea of surveillance, and that's, I think, what you're asking about. That somebody like me, I'm not a black person, and I'm Iranian American, I'm a person of color, but I can pass with many of the privileges of the experience of space. So there are a lot of things I don't see. And they were talking about how even the presence of cameras and surveillance on campus make it an oppressive space for certain people and certain bodies, where, if you tie that to, if you're smoking marijuana and you're white, that has certain consequences. If you're smoking marijuana and you're black, that has very different consequences. So just something that maybe a white student or I might not perceive about campus architecture, the placement of cameras, for somebody else is actually a very oppressive experience. And so these were things that came out of that class that I thought were very helpful to think about how is space designed in ways that a lot of us are blind to. We don't think twice about. Our privilege allows us to think about security in a way that we don't think is racialized, but ultimately it is, even oppressively so for many students.
At the beginning of the podcast, we heard from a student at Naropa that experienced, this is a year ago, it's not, it's really a year ago. It's going to be, I think it was March 1st that you mentioned, Ramon Gabrielov Parrish, that you as a teacher, you were in the class and you said to your students, this is the reason why we are studying this. We need to understand that, racism is alive, and there's police brutality, there's violence against people.
Yeah, it was about a year ago. I was teaching another session of the diversity seminar, and Naropa, most of our students are white. There's very few Black students. It's very few Latino, very few Native students, very few Asian students. I mean, it's a small school in general, but the student of color populations and the international populations are small. And so oftentimes what it looks like is there's a lot of attention that's turned to the white students in a way. And sometimes and it's a required class, so people don't choose to take the class. So there's a little bit of resistance sometimes that comes up. And so sometimes students feel like, well, I mean, you're just going to accuse me of being racist. They're like, what is this class about? Like, why do I have to do this? And a lot of times these white students haven't witnessed, or they haven't enacted like sort of direct interpersonal hostility, which is what a lot of us think of as racism, direct interpersonal hostility based on color. And so they're like, does it even exist? And why is it my problem? And so we had a situation where one of our students, and the student was employed by the school to pick up the garbage around the dorm. So he was at work, and he was seen from the street by a police officer. He was pulled over by the police officer. He showed the police officer his school ID, and the student lives out of state. So a state ID or driver's license, you may not have that. You don't necessarily need it. Okay, and when you're in a different state and you're at a university, showed him his school ID. That wasn't sufficient for the officer, and at that point, the situation became combative. And if you watch the tape, because here's what happened. They had the police camera, which that tape came out later. And then some of the students who were inside of the dorm, many of them white. Okay, I think one of them was actually African American. They filmed the police altercation with the students, and they put it on YouTube. They broke the story. And they were watching one of their classmates, one police officer, 2, 6. There was between 6 and 8 police officers. They had riot shields. One police officer pulled out his gun. And I mean, it was deadly. And it was just like that. And so that reverberated through the school. And I actually had contact with the student right after it happened, like an hour maybe after it happened. And it reverberated through the school. And I think it was a real wake-up call. And unfortunately, the last that I heard of this case, the police officers were not found of any wrongdoing. So it's not just an issue of like punishing that individual police officer. It's like, why did that happen in the first place? Why was that student seen as someone that driving by you should stop the car for? He had one of those sticks with the kind of the grip that you use to pick up trash. It's a thin aluminum stick. The police officer said, "You have a weapon, put that down." And this student, actually he stayed inside of his skin, because a situation like that will make you jump out of your skin. You can go into paralysis. You can go into all kinds of things. And the student stayed inside of his skin, and he's like, you know what? I'm not going to do that. I showed you my ID. He had a bucket, and it's obvious. It's obvious what was happening in that situation. And the police officer could have said, okay, I pulled you over, blah, 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 show me your ID, you're at work here. End of situation, if it even needed to happen in the first place. So I don't exactly know what the city of Boulder is doing, but there's some kind of training that they need to enhance about implicit bias. There's something that they need to enhance about like how to de-escalate a situation, because they escalated that situation. They could have killed this dude, and it just for nothing, So, and that's when we start to get into the difference between diversity, inclusion, and equity. Equity, you have to start to tweak the structural mechanics of institutions and how people are trained, so that like we don't have systems that recreate certain attitudes over and over, and that basically sweep certain attitudes or actions under the rug.
Yeah, those attitudes, just like you're saying. And yes, you are right. The city of Boulder is doing a training. And one of our interviewees, Nikhil Mankekar, who also produces a show here in KGNU about people of color too. He is, behind, he's spearheading this training, for the police. And I think that is extremely important. Something that must be done, be done to really understand these issues in a deeper way. Chiquita, yes.
Yeah, of course I can't just sit here and not say as a mother of 2 African American men, that's horrifying. When I watched that video, I mean, I didn't want to see the whole thing because I'm scared that he would have gotten shot or, you know, something would have happened to him. And I think about that with my boys. When my youngest son went to college at University of Kansas, and he didn't tell me until like a month later that he was looking for his friend. He went off campus to drive and to find his friend's apartment. And he's on the phone talking to his friend, like, what building is it? What building is it? What building are you? You know, where are you? Next thing you know, 5 police officers show up because an elderly white lady looked at him and I guess she was scared because why? He was targeted. He was Black. He had a vehicle. You know, he's on the phone saying, what building are you in? And they start questioning him. And why? For what reason? Same thing. And I'm glad that he didn't tell me at that moment. I would have been freaking out. I'm so scared. And that's something that, I mean, non-people of color have to worry about when their kids go to another state or go to the South. My other son is in the South. He has, you know, he carry arms with him. And that scares me too. That's his right. But that scares me too, because if he ever gets pulled over and they know that he has a gun, bam. I mean, they can go home eventually to their families, and then I would have lost my son. That's a fear that a lot of people do not have to worry about. And it should not be like that. It's a way of life for me. A way of life. And is that right? Is that a good life? Is that being equitable in our community? No.
Can I add one more thing?
Sure.
Yeah, and because the other thing is that we see, this is after years of people uploading encounters with police, you know, that either there was some level of racial profiling that was going on, or encounters that ended in death. Okay, this is after years of people uploading these videos, and I think that there's a sense by a lot of people in Boulder, and it was. I think it's also exists at Naropa, but Naropa is symbolic of a lot of what's happening in Boulder. There's a sense that, well, these kind of things don't happen here. That happens in Denver. Because Boulder, we're enlightened. Boulder, we're sustainable. We're green. We're progressive. And then bam, and so it's not really. I mean, it can happen anywhere, and it's happening all over the place.
Can I speak to that? I think the colorblindness with which people kind of situate that approach, or that the inability to empathize or understand, and I'm guilty of this myself. Like, I can't experience that directly, and so I'm on the verge of thinking about, you know, these things don't happen here. That to me seems so sinister. It seems like such a dark veil over this inequality and this injustice that makes it, I think, so much worse than other injustices that, you know, I have the privilege of studying about. So, you know, coming from Iran and Iran, there is solidarity. People get it. You know, there is oppression. We're all experiencing it. We all get it. But in America, that doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. You could be in a liberal place like Boulder, and people will be shocked when you say that you're uncomfortable at a cafe waiting in line. How could the barista not be friendly? How could there be racism in a place as progressive as this in our cafes? Now, take it from there, and I mean, every space just gets more and more racist. And I think that blindness to the racism that we all embody, or I speak for myself, makes it that much more sinister.
We heard a lot of experiences of different people of color in Boulder County, many problems, but what are the solutions?
Anybody who wants to go first?
I let the scholars go first.
Well, I mean, I think there's different levels of solution. one level is to keep doing things like this, keep having conversations in public. I think another level that, again, when we talk about equity, is to also look at, one thing that I think is a major, really the cost of living here and the cost of housing. And that's not just about race, that's also nationality, that's also class. It even actually has something to do with sustainability efforts, right? So the cost of living here, the price of housing. So I think if those things can be looked at, in addition to having these kinds of conversations in public, that's at least a step.
Well, I don't know if we have a solution, to be honest. We've been having conversations for a mighty long time. And we understand that white people have really good intentions. But what is the solution after the intention? What is your action? And people need to start doing instead of talking. Listening and doing. Hear from us. We have these conversations. Listen to what we're talking about and then do something about it. Just don't talk about it. We've been talking for decades and centuries. So it's time for us to start being active.
Not the right person to ask. I struggle with this a lot, but I'll just share random ideas that what you're both saying bring up. I'm reading actually right now this book on race by Howard Zinn, which was a gift, by the way, from a friend of KGNU. And he's talking about the history of nonviolent movements, but also militant nonviolence. And my sense from this is a frustration with how even, say, the civil rights movement was hijacked, taken over, removed of its militancy, and its ability to affect meaningful change, because that racism persists, segregation in schools has increased. The stories from 300, 200, 150 years ago and today, they don't seem all that different. And so I think what you're saying about, there's this hopelessness on the one hand, that I don't know, is it so fundamental? Is it so core to the definition of America for Americans? All sorts of ideologies that build on racism, that can it be challenged without something that I can't even imagine? So I'm confused and I don't have a good answer, but I think, I defer to you guys.
It has been a wonderful conversation, and I would like to thank my guest this morning, Ramon Gabrielov Parrish, Assistant Professor at Naropa University, Shikita Yarbrough, Community Engagement Equity Manager at YWCA of Boulder County, and Shaheen Raubari, Assistant Professor of Social Justice and Architecture, CU Environmental Design. It has been a wonderful conversation. We will continue this conversation. So many things that came up. Please subscribe to the Trends podcast wherever you get your podcast, and we will be back next month. For KGNU, I am Rosana Longo.